So nice to see you all. I want to start by telling a story. There was a man who decided he wanted to build a boat. And so he spent more than a year working on this boat. And he lovingly steamed the planks to bend them. And he made all the ribs and the gunnels by hand, forged the oarlocks, and put many, many coats of spar varnish on it. It was beautiful, beautiful boat. And it was a work of love for him. And shortly after he finished it, it was a gorgeous day like this. So he said, I know, I'm going to take the boat out into the little lake, and I'm going to go out to the middle of the lake, and I'm going to enjoy a nap. So he went out into the boat, and he laid down in the sunshine, drifted off to sleep. And then all of a sudden, bang, another boat just banged into his brand new boat. And boy, was he mad. He came up from his nap, and he was going to give that person a piece of his mind. And he was ready to tell him off, and he got up, and he saw that the boat was empty. There was nobody in the boat. The boat had just loosed its moorings, drifted out into the lake, and they went bonk into each other. What do you do with his anger then? There was nothing to be angry at. No one to blame. So I'm telling this story because I think this morning during our sitting, our boat got bumped a couple times. You might have noticed that. You might have come in the door from doing the outdoor movement and walked into this heat, right? This heat, wow, it was hot in here. And and then maybe later, as we were sitting, you might have noticed there was music playing. Right? There was music faintly playing, yeah. Like bump, our boat got bumped. So here's my question. Did you suffer when those things happened? Did you suffer? Now, here's what I mean by suffering. So before you say no, did your mind go, whose music is that? How could you be so inconsiderate? Who forgot that? What's going on here? Or when you felt the heat, did you think maybe something like, you know, getting the heat right in a meditation retreat is just a basic thing. Can't we pull this together, people? Or something like that. Maybe it wasn't quite that harsh, but maybe there was a little bit somewhere, right? That is suffering. That is suffering. I really want to do a retreat on the 12 links of interdependent arising sometime. And I think this points to that. So I'm not going to go into it a whole lot, but there's a very, very, very short time between our perception when something comes into our ear or touches our skin in the heat, as the heat did, between that perception and our idea about it. A very short time. In fact, such a short time that it feels like the same thing. So when you hear that music, the first thing that comes to mind isn't there's a sound. The first thing that comes to mind is, oh man, I was really hoping to sit here and meditate in peace. This is the best time of day to do that, and who's messing this up? And that happens immediately. Immediately. So, maybe you say you don't suffer, but maybe you really did. Maybe you really did. Now, to make sure this doesn't happen again, our wonderful Zendo master, Ellen, will be the one who controls the heat. And she does a great job with that. She's been doing this since the whole time we've been here. And she's figured out exactly how much wood needs to go into that stove so she can match the conditions. So the rest of us can just rest in Ellen's guidance. She will protect us. Oh, thank you, Ellen, for that. Doing such a beautiful job. We all suffer. Every one of us suffers. All of us have endured pain, and all of us have been betrayed and hurt, left behind, left out, unseen, dominated. We could list those and list those and list those, and none of us escapes it. And even worse, oftentimes that stuff happens with the people we love the most. And you might have noticed in the news that our world's a mess. Even while we've been on retreat, the world's gotten into a bigger mess than when we arrived. And how could it be otherwise? Because every one of us is a mess. Every one of us. We're all suffering. And so we make collective suffering out of that. And our collective suffering imposes on other people's suffering, on the planet's suffering. We're making a real mess of it. But it's not just us. If you look back over history, humans have been suffering all along. The conditions have been different. The particulars about why their lives are difficult are different, but people have been suffering all along. The Buddha, 2,500 years ago, he suffered just like we suffer. What was wonderful about the Buddha was that he was so moved by that he gave up almost everything that he had to understand that suffering and to help find a way out of it for himself and for us all. Just think for a minute what he gave up. He gave up power and wealth and comfort, and he gave up his family. I don't think we've given up quite that much. But I do think that we're here for the same reason the Buddha went on his quest. We want to understand suffering. We want to help heal suffering in ourselves and in the world. So we have that in common with the Buddha. And it doesn't matter that what the Buddha faced was different than what we face. He didn't have to face this new war in the Middle East. He didn't have to face the war in Ukraine. He didn't have to face global warming, climate change. But he had his own things to face, and they were equally as difficult. His own cousin tried to kill him twice. Mine hasn't, so I don't have to face that. So I think that we show up for a lot the same reason that the Buddha showed up, for practice. I think we want to understand our suffering. And how wonderful. How wonderful that we're walking his path and still trying to do that. And we have to discover ultimately what the Buddha discovered, which is that if we want to taste liberation, we have to be willing to go right into the heart of our suffering. That's the only way. We can't go around it. We can't have someone else take it away for us. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. We have to be willing, just like the Buddha, to go straight into the heart of our suffering. And that's where we find the liberation. As Mike said, that's the door, it's the gate, it's the key, it's the whole enchilada. So today I'm going to talk about suffering, about how we generate it, um, what it does to us. And then in the next talk, I'll do the same for liberation. I'll talk about liberation later. So today's going to be a lot about suffering. And I'll start with what I know, which is my own suffering. Mike mentioned that he and I both have had some health challenges over the last couple of years. And about 10 years ago, I started having symptoms of this neurological condition that is in my family, that my mother has and her grandmother had. And it was a little annoying. but it was no big deal. It caused me to lose some sleep, but no big deal. And then about 2 years ago, it really got worse, all of a sudden, quite quickly. And it went from being an annoyance to being a disability. I had these physical sensations and these involuntary movements in my body, and they made it difficult to sleep because they happen whenever I sit down or lie down. And that's how I sleep. I don't sleep standing up. Um, so it became very, very difficult to sleep, and I began to dread going to bed because bedtime became a struggle and a suffering. And in the morning, I was more tired than when I went to bed. I just wanted to crawl out of my skin. So I don't want that pain. I don't want that suffering. So what did I do? I went to the doctor. I went to the doctor and I told the doctor, here I am, make me better. I want to be like I was. And the doctor said, well, there's good news and there's bad news. The good news is we have a number of drugs to treat this condition, and the bad news is that none of them work. And they don't work because we don't understand what it is. But he gave me a test. There's a 40-point scale that you scale on, 0 to 40, more severe the higher number you go, and I scored 34, which was very severe. It's called on that scale. And that was not news to me, but it kind of gave me okay, this is where I am. And I also learned something that helped put me in perspective, that people with this condition have a suicide rate 4 times higher than people with chronic pain. And I understand that. I understand that. So he and I started working together. He prescribed me the first medication, and the first medication had some effect. And for a couple, 3 weeks maybe, symptoms were better, and then they weren't. And we went to the next drug, and we went to the next drug, and we went to the next drug. And we got to a whole class of drugs that I started taking that had the effect of making it better for a while, and then starting to make it worse. And in my case, really dramatically worse. So what I had to do was then withdraw off of those medications because my body was dependent on them. And that was probably one of the most difficult times, was when I was withdrawing from those medications and had those sensations on top of the other sensations. But what was actually worse than withdrawing from the medications was withdrawing from hope. Because every new medication that I took, I had this hope that said, ah, this is the one. And it would be for a little bit. I think, ah, finally, I can go back to the way I was. And I had that hope. And when it stopped working, much more crushing than the physical symptoms or the withdrawal symptoms was the hope crashing. That was devastating. So I spent about 18 months on that little journey of doing those drugs. And the Mayo Clinic has this whole algorithm of drugs that you move through. And during this time, I was sleeping 1 to 2 hours a night. And I was so exhausted that my life dramatically changed. I could literally feel the life force leaving my body. I had never experienced anything like that before, but I could see how the body just won't continue. Yeah. And I was trying all the ways I could to cope with this. And so one of the things that I would do would be I would walk the house at night while my wife and my dog slept. I would walk round and around. And I didn't want to be up walking, and so I suffered. I fought that. I wanted to be asleep, but here I was walking. I had to step back from many things that I wanted to do. I had to step back from my role in the Sangha. I had to step back from the things that I love, like making furniture and hiking and traveling and being with friends and being with my family. I had to let go of all those things. About all I could do was just sit there and suffer. And when I say sit there and suffer, what I mean is I sat there and resented it, didn't want it, pushed it away. And that suffering was particularly acute in the middle of the night when it was dark and I was just dog tired. And I finally found that I could stand next to my bed and rock back and forth from one leg to the other. And it was about like walking. So I would just do that. And it was as dark inside of me as it was outside of me because I did not want this. And I would stand there next to the bed and I would be angry and I would be frustrated and I would cry and I'd be afraid. I'd be outraged. That to me sounds a lot like the definition of suffering. And it was actually a really important lesson because usually the volume is really low on those things when we're suffering and we can bypass it and not pay any attention to it. But I had no choice. The volume was up on 11 and I could not bypass it. So one night as I stood there next to my bed, suffering, I remembered the Buddha. I don't know why it took me that long, but I remembered the Buddha. And I realized that the Buddha had spent years seeking an end to suffering. And he had gone from teacher to teacher, from practice to practice. He even tried depriving his body of nourishment on the idea that maybe it was the body that was the source of the suffering, and that if he could just tame this body, the body would end his suffering. And I realized that, well, I realized that what he had to do was find a way to practice with that, to recover from his suffering. And so what he did was he had this determination, this strong determination that said, all these things aren't working. I am going to sit here under this tree and I'm going to face my life like it is, and I'm going to see my way through suffering. And it wasn't some special tree. It wasn't some magic thing. It wasn't a new teacher or a new practice. It was the tree in front of him. It was that tree. And he sat there. And I realized that I needed to do that too. I needed to do that too. I spent so much of my effort wishing this wasn't true. And I thought, I have to do like the Buddha did. I have to find my way right into the heart of my suffering instead of trying to make it go away. So, just like he had gone from practice to practice, I went from drug to drug. And just like he went from teacher to teacher, I read all the medical literature. I talked to all my doctor friends. I did, I got as much education as I could. And just like he wore his body down with resistance to the body, I wore myself down with resistance to this disease. So I thought, well, maybe I'll just try what the Buddha did. Maybe it'll work. So I stood there next to the bed and I resolved that I will face this moment exactly as it is. This moment that I do not like, that I do not want. This is the only moment I have. If I don't live this moment, what moment will I have? So I came with that determination, finally, to say, this is my only moment. I will live it. And when I did that, my suffering lessened a little bit more each time. I found that I could enjoy walking around the house in the middle of the night. I have not seen the night sky very much. I got to see the night sky. I got to enjoy the quiet of the house when no one is moving. I got to be out there and see that. I wasn't better, but I wasn't suffering. And then I got to the last drug on the algorithm. And guess what? It kind of works. It kind of works. So I've been taking it for several months now, and it's got some nasty side effects. It's a pretty powerful drug, but I'm sleeping again. But I'm not under the illusion that this has fixed it, that this has taken away my suffering. It's one of the things that Michael and I have both decided in our journey, that this is not a cure, this is a reprieve, that we're going to see it again. It'll be back. It'll be back. But for now, I'm not suffering. And I'm not suffering because the symptoms aren't there. I'm not suffering because I'm willing to go into the heart of my suffering and come through the other side. So I'm telling you this story not to compare myself to the Buddha or to say I'm like a Buddha or anything like that. I'm telling this because we all have two important things in common with the Buddha and with each other. And those are that we suffer, all of us. There's no way around it. And the other thing is, we all have the capacity to transform our suffering into liberation. There's nothing special about the Buddha. We are like the Buddha. The Buddha is like us. We have that same capacity. What made the Buddha different was that the Buddha really did it. Right? The Buddha was willing to sacrifice a great deal to address suffering in the world. And if we are, we can also transform our suffering into liberation. We're Buddhas in training. We're on the way there now. And you could tell your story of suffering. Every one of us in here has stories of suffering. It's one of the really amazing things that Michael and I get to do is we get to meet with you very intimately, and we get to hear the stories of people's suffering. And what an incredible privilege it is to hear people's stories. And I wish you all could have the perspective that that gives, which is every one of us is suffering. Every one of us. If we could remember that when we saw someone walking down the street that we thought was a real pain, if we could really see their suffering, we would have a very different view of them. And I hope that when we look around this Sangha and someone does something that annoys us or isn't quite right, that we can look at that person and know that that person is carrying so much more than we imagine. And it's important for all of us to tell the story of our suffering. And I want to suggest three different ways that it's important. And these ways tend to show up at different places in our practice. So the initial reason we might want to tell the story of our suffering is to overcome the delusion that we don't suffer. Right? That delusion is the face of popular culture. When you look at popular culture, you look at movies, you look at television, you look at the people who are famous that we hold up, almost every one of them projects an image that I got it together. My favorite one is there's a look on the faces of the models in car ads. They're driving and they've mastered the smug, happy look that says, I got it. You just look, it's in almost every single car ad, the I don't suffer face. You poor thing, you're suffering. But I've got this new Buick. So as long as we have the delusion that we don't suffer, we are really stuck because we can't even begin to get approach that transformation of our suffering because we have done what's called spiritual bypassing. We have said, this is not happening to me. I've got it all together. You should be envious. I love what Norman Fisher says. He says, until you realize that your mind is a mess, you have not begun practicing. That this is the first step on the path to practice, to be able to admit to yourself, I suffer. I am a mess. Yeah. So that's a good reason to tell your story of suffering, so that you don't have the delusion that you don't suffer. And I certainly have had that. And I continue to have that because this is not at all a one and done thing. We have to do this over and over and over because we're like an onion that just comes apart layer after layer. And we have to do it with every new layer. So that's the first stage. Now, the second stage of telling our story is we tell it so that we can see it clearly. We can really know what our suffering is, honestly. Michael mentioned that we've been looking into core suffering. And core suffering usually starts when we are very young, when we have a child's mind. And a child's mind is a pretty self-centered mind because that's how a young mind works. And so you encounter this imperfect world, a parent who doesn't treat you well, or a culture that has no room for you, or any of the almost infinite number of ways that we encounter imperfection in the world. And what does a child mind do? It says, that's my fault. There's something wrong with me. I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm unlovable. All those things that Mike so beautifully laid out for us, and more. Every one of us has this. And the reason that I'm even going into this, because we could really do a whole retreat, which we've done on this, do another one, is that what this shows us is that we have to see our suffering clearly, because what we're usually doing is just replaying that childhood view of our suffering. And we're using a child's understanding to live an adult's life. So telling the story of our suffering clearly helps us. And then the third way, and for me this is the, the final stage because I don't know what's next, but there probably is something next. But the final stage of telling stories that I've experienced is to tell the story of suffering not as mine, but as ours. It's to move from the story of poor me to, oh my gosh, I want to care for us. From self-centeredness to compassion. So when we tell the story of, for instance, our anger in this way, we don't see it as my anger. We see it as anger. Anger arises in all of us. And this is what it feels like. Ouch. I don't want that for anyone. And I don't want to behave in a way that causes that in other people. So our suffering becomes now the basis of compassionate action in the world. We'll have a chance to think about our stories of suffering when we, particularly in our Dharma sharing groups. And you might just notice as you tell your story of suffering, Where are you in the way you're telling your story of suffering? It might help you see where you are on the path, not to judge yourself or say you should be somewhere else, but just to clarify for yourself. Let's talk a little bit more about the nature of suffering. And I want to use a metaphor for that. I want to talk about the war that we're fighting inside of ourselves. There's a war in all of us between the way things are and the way we want them to be. In my story, it was between a war between the reality of my illness and my belief that that shouldn't happen to me. Other people, okay, I'll take care of you. Me? No, that should not happen to me. That's the war. I started fighting a war. And most of us are not aware that we're fighting a war. We just think we're right. We just think we're right, and we're going to go impose that on the world. I'm right. And none of us escape this because it's part of our human psyche to do this. So there's nothing wrong with you that you've got a war going. It's just what we do. I like to think of it as the world is actually like this. And now it's like this. And now it's like this. It's this perpetually flowing river of change that presents itself to us. But what we do is we say, no, I don't want that river. I don't want like this. I want like that. And like that is not a flowing river. Like that is a fixed idea. This is what it's like if it's good. And if it's not like that, I'm going to go to war. So maybe that happened for some of us this morning with the conditions in the Zendo. I know I had the urge to go to war with the music I could hear playing. Oh, it shouldn't be like that. But it was. It was like this. So I did my best to simply hear the sound. Simply hear the sound. Now, according to the Buddha, we go to war basically in three ways. The first way is we go to war with things that we don't like. We don't want it to be like this. And we call that aversion. Sometimes we call that hatred. I don't want it. I'm going to change it. Another way that we go to war is that we go to war for things that we do want. Conditions aren't right, and so I want this, and I want it now, and I want it to last forever. That's called grasping or greed. And then the third one is that we don't want to notice what things are like. We don't want to pay any attention at all, and that's called ignorance. And when I think of what we're experiencing now with the climate changing, we as a human family have been living in ignorance for 100 years or more, ignorant of what we were doing to the environment, what we were doing to the atmosphere. We actively did not want to know. So now we get the other kind of suffering. I don't want that, and I'm going to fight against that. No. The world isn't what makes us suffer. It's one of those three things that the Buddha told us that make us suffer. It's our grasping, it's our aversion, and it's our ignorance. The world is fine as it is. It's those three things that make us suffer. I want to tell you another story. Um, Ashoka was a king that lived in India about 2,300 years ago. And apparently he was quite a warlike guy and pretty good at it. And so he conquered a lot of territory, and he was known for coming in with his fierce armies and eliminating the opposition. Sound familiar in our world? Yeah. So after one battle that was particularly bloody, the battle was over, and Ashoka was looking over the battlefield, and the battlefield was strewn with bodies of humans and of animals, and of the crying out wounded, and of loved ones that were seeking their person. And Ashoka looked out at this and he thought, you know, I just won this battle. I've got what I wanted and I'm not happy. And then he sees a monk that's walking across the battlefield, tending to the bodies, tending to the wounded, to the loved ones crying over their loss. And Ashoka saw in that monk what he did not have. He saw that the monk was peaceful, was not suffering. So Ashoka, being a powerful one, said, "Bring that monk to me." And they brought the monk to Ashoka. And Ashoka said to the monk, "I won this war, but I'm still unhappy. And here you are, powerless, poor, and you are content. Why?" And the monk said to Ashoka, "I laid down my war. Is it time for you to lay down yours?" And Ashoka became a student of the Buddha. He did lay down his war. And he transformed the suffering that caused him to be warlike into a leader that was remarkably compassionate, especially for that era. And there are these columns in which Ashoka had inscribed the laws of the land. And they're still around. You can still see them and read them. They're still finding more of them. And it describes laws in which Ashoka was doing the best he could to rule for the common good and with compassion after he had been such a warlike king. I find that really moving. So I want to ask us all a question. What are you at war with? What are you at war with? Ashoka was at war with anything that threatened his power or his prestige. What are you at war with? I think it's very fortunate that we aren't powerful rulers that have the ability to cause great widespread suffering. At least we don't have that, but that doesn't mean we're not at war. I was at war with my illness for sure. And I'm at war again and again with many things. We have a sutra that helps us get started in looking at this, and it's called the Five Remembrances. The Five Remembrances are 5 things that we do not want in our lives and that we are willing to go to war with. And those are getting old, getting ill, dying, losing what we love, and having the consequences of our actions face us. These are 5 things that are common to human beings that we're all at war with. And my story showed that I was at war really with all those things. Now, I didn't want to age. I didn't have this when I was younger. I didn't have this 10, 20, 15 years ago. I don't want to age. I don't want to have it now. I want to go back like it was. Thank you. Take me there. I shouldn't be sick. I care for people who are sick. That doesn't happen to me. I'm going to go to war. I could feel the life force draining out of my body, and I don't want to die. I was losing all the things I wanted to do, the things that gave me meaning. That hurt the most. That was where I really went to war. And I even went to war with my karma because this was hereditary. So I went to war with the karma of the genes that brought this into my life. So I was definitely at war. But what are you at war with? I'd like to invite us to bring that question forward like a koan that we can hold. What am I at war with? You might want to explore it in the Dharma sharing groups. One nice thing about a retreat is that it slows us down. It removes the momentum that we carry. I don't know if you felt this when you arrived, but when we arrive at retreat, it shows us how fast we're moving. Boom, boom, boom. And we get to retreat, and all of a sudden that energy isn't necessary, and we slow down. And when we do that, that clears open a listening space that we have, that we can see things like, what war am I fighting? We couldn't see it when we were driving on I-5 on the way down here. We couldn't see it when we were trying to get all the things done we had to get done to make the space for us to be here. But now we can see it. And let's not waste this moment. So please let your story come forward. Let your story of suffering come forward. So you know the war that you're fighting. So you have that clarity. And you can use that clarity to transform your suffering into liberation. I want to end by reading a fragment of a poem. It's called Clearing by Martha Postlethwaite. Create a clearing in the dense forest of your life and wait there patiently until the song that is your life falls into your own cupped hands and you recognize and greet it. Only then will you know how to give yourself to this world. Once more. Create a clearing in the dense forest of your life and wait there patiently until the song that is your life falls into your own cupped hands and you recognize and greet it. Only then will you know how to give yourself to this world.